Sarah Martinez walked into St. Mary's Hospital for another day of work. She was a cleaning lady, and she knew every corner of that building like the back of her hand. Her cart squeaked as she pushed it down the hallway, and some nurses waved at her with warm smiles. They all knew Sarah. She was the one who always had a kind word for everyone, even the patients who couldn't talk back. Today was different, though. The whole hospital was buzzing with excitement. A famous businessman, Richard Davidson, was getting rushed in after a terrible car accident. Sarah watched as doctors and nurses ran past her, their shoes squeaking on the freshly mopped floor. "Out of the way," someone shouted, and Sarah quickly moved her cart aside. There he was, lying on the stretcher, even unconscious. Richard Davidson looked important in his torn, expensive suit. His face was scratched, and his perfectly styled hair was now a mess, but Sarah could tell he was handsome. She'd seen him in the newspapers and on TV. Everyone knew about the big wedding that was supposed to happen today. Poor man, Sarah thought. Instead of saying "I do" to his beautiful fiancée, he was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. The next few hours were chaos. Reporters camped outside the hospital trying to get any information they could. Important-looking people in suits rushed in and out. And then she arrived. Victoria Stone, the fiancée everyone was talking about. Victoria walked in like she owned the place, her high heels clicking on the floor. Her makeup was perfect, and she was still wearing her wedding dress, though it looked like she'd modified it for the cameras. Photographers followed her everywhere. "Oh, my darling," Victoria cried out when she saw Richard, but Sarah, who was cleaning nearby, noticed something odd. Victoria didn't touch him. She didn't even get too close. She just posed for photos and talked to reporters about how devastated she was. That night, when things quieted down, Sarah went in to clean Richard's room. She looked at him lying there, all these machines beeping around him. Something about him seemed lonely, even with all those important people coming to visit. "You know," she said softly while wiping down the bedside table, "they say people in comas can hear us. I don't know if that's true, but it must be pretty boring lying here all day." Sarah finished cleaning but found herself talking more. "I saw your fiancée today. She's very beautiful, but if you don't mind me saying, she seemed more interested in the cameras than in you." Days passed and Sarah developed a routine. She'd clean Richard's room last, spending a little extra time there. She'd tell him about her day, about the hospital gossip, about her life. Sometimes she'd bring a book and read to him during her break. Meanwhile, things were happening behind the scenes. Victoria's visits became shorter and less frequent. Instead, Richard's brother James started showing up more often, always with lawyers in tow. Sarah overheard things while cleaning, whispered conversations about company shares, about power of attorney, about control of the business. One day Sarah was cleaning when James and Victoria had a heated discussion in the hallway. "We need to move faster," Victoria was saying. "I can't keep pretending to be the grieving fiancé forever." "Just a little more time," James replied. "Once we have control of everything, you'll get what we agreed on." Sarah's heart sank. These people were supposed to love Richard, but they were plotting against him while he lay helpless in a hospital bed. That evening, Sarah sat by Richard's bed with tears in her eyes. "I wish you could hear me," she said. "Your brother and Victoria, they're up to something bad. You need to wake up." She reached out and held his hand, something she'd never done before. "I know I'm just the cleaning lady, and we've never even had a real conversation, but I see you, the real you. Not your money or your business, just you, and you deserve better than what they're doing to you." As she got up to leave, she felt it, the slightest pressure on her fingers. She looked down at their hands, then at his face. Did he just squeeze her hand? "Richard," she whispered. His eyelids fluttered. Sarah's heart raced. She pressed the call button, and within moments, the room was filled with medical staff. As they checked his vital signs and ran tests, Sarah slipped quietly out of the room. But she couldn't stop smiling. He was waking up. She had no idea that this was just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, Sarah wondered what would happen next. Would Richard remember her voice? Would he understand the danger he was in? And most importantly, Would he see her, really see her, once he opened his eyes? The night shift was ending and the first rays of sunrise were peeking through the hospital windows. Sarah gathered her things, ready to head home. But before she left, she took one last look at Richard's room. Something was different now. Hope had replaced despair and possibilities hung in the air like the morning light. "See you tonight," she whispered, and walked away carrying a secret in her heart. The secret of a hand squeeze that might have been nothing, but felt like everything. The doctors couldn't explain it, but Richard Davidson was definitely waking up. His brain activity had increased, and he was responding to stimuli. The news spread through St. Mary's Hospital like wildfire. Sarah arrived for her evening shift to find the hallways packed with reporters again. Victoria was there too, looking fresh from the salon, posing for photographs by Richard's door. This time she'd brought an enormous bouquet of roses that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. "My love is bringing him back," Victoria told the reporters, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Our connection is so strong he can feel my presence." Sarah kept her head down and continued cleaning, but she couldn't help rolling her eyes. Where had Victoria been for the past 3 weeks? She'd only shown up twice, and both times were when the press was there. James Davidson arrived shortly after, looking worried. Sarah pretended to clean the same spot on the wall while she listened to him argue with Victoria in the hallway. "This wasn't supposed to happen so soon," James hissed. "We haven't finished transferring all the assets." "Well, do something," Victoria snapped back. "I didn't waste 6 months planning a wedding just to end up with nothing." They quickly separated. When they noticed a nurse approaching, Sarah's blood boiled. These people were supposed to be Richard's family, but all they cared about was his money. Later that night, when the visitors had gone and the hospital was quiet, Sarah went into Richard's room. The roses Victoria had brought were already wilting, dropping petals on the floor. Sarah cleaned them up and replaced them with the small bunch of daisies she'd picked from her garden. "Those fancy roses were pretty," she told Richard while arranging the daisies, "but these will last longer, just like real love lasts longer than show." She sat in her usual chair beside his bed. "Everyone's excited that you're waking up, but I need to tell you something important. Your brother and Victoria, they're planning something bad. I've heard them talking. They're trying to take everything from you while you're lying here." Sarah reached for his hand, something she'd started doing more often since that first squeeze. "I know it's not my place to say these things, I'm just the cleaning lady. But somebody has to look out for you, and right now I seem to be the only one who cares about you and not your money." Suddenly, Richard's fingers tightened around hers. His eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, finally, they opened. Sarah's heart stopped. His eyes were blue like a clear summer sky, and they were looking right at her. "Water," he whispered, his voice rough from weeks of silence. Sarah jumped up and helped him sip some water through a straw. Her hands were shaking. "I'll get the nurse," she said, reaching for the call button, but Richard's grip on her hand tightened. "Wait," he said. "Your voice. I know your voice." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "You could hear me. Every word," he whispered. "You've been here, reading to me, talking to me." Before Sarah could respond, the room filled with medical staff. She slipped her hand free and backed away, watching as doctors checked Richard's vital signs and tested his responses. He was weak but alert, answering their questions clearly. Sarah quietly pushed her cleaning cart out of the room. Her heart was racing. He'd heard her. All those hours she'd spent talking to him, reading to him, warning him about his brother and Victoria. He'd heard everything. The next morning, Sarah's phone woke her up. It was her supervisor at the hospital. "Sarah, I'm sorry, but you've been reassigned to a different floor. Mr. Davidson's family has requested a new cleaning service for his room." Her heart sank. Of course, James and Victoria must have seen her with Richard when he woke up. They wouldn't want her anywhere near him now. When Sarah arrived at work that evening, the hospital was buzzing with excitement. Richard Davidson was making a remarkable recovery. He was sitting up, talking, even eating solid food, but Sarah couldn't see him anymore. She was restricted to the 3rd floor, far from his private room on the 7th. As she mopped the floors, hand-emptied trash cans, Sarah tried to convince herself it was for the best. What had she expected? She was just the cleaning lady who'd kept a coma patient company. Now that he was awake, he'd go back to his world of wealth and privilege, and she'd go back to hers. But late that night, as she was getting ready to leave, one of the nurses from the 7th floor came running up to her. "Sarah, Mr. Davidson's been asking for you. He wants to see you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "But his family..." The nurse smiled. "He's not asking his family. He's asking for you." Sarah looked down at her cleaning uniform, suddenly self-conscious, but the nurse was already pulling her toward the elevator. "Go on," she said. "He's still weak, but he's been asking about you all day. Says he needs to thank the woman with the beautiful voice who kept him company in the darkness." As the elevator doors closed, Sarah took a deep breath. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing. The man she'd talked to all those nights, the man who'd listened to her stories and held her hand, wanted to see her, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Sarah's hands trembled as the elevator climbed to the 7th floor. What would she say to Richard? More importantly, what did he want to say to her? The doors opened and she stepped out, her heart pounding. But before she could reach Richard's room, Victoria stormed out of it, her face red with anger. She stopped dead when she saw Sarah. "You!" Victoria pointed a perfectly manicured finger at her. "How dare you come up here? Haven't you caused enough trouble?" Sarah stood her ground. "Mr. Davidson asked to see me." Victoria laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Listen, little cleaning lady, Richard is confused right now. The doctors say it's normal after a coma. He doesn't know what he's asking for." "That's where you're wrong, Victoria." Richard's voice came from the doorway. He was in a wheelchair, looking pale but determined. A nurse stood behind him, ready to help if needed. "I know exactly what I'm asking for. I want to talk to Sarah." Victoria's face turned even redder. "Richard, darling, you need to rest. This servant has been filling your head with lies while you were unconscious." "The only lies I've heard," Richard said firmly, "are the ones coming from you and my brother. Sarah warned me about your plans. Did you really think I wouldn't find out what you've been doing with my company?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Then she grabbed her designer purse and stormed off toward the elevator, nearly tripping in her high heels. Richard turned to Sarah with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Would you like to come in?" The nurse helped Richard back to his bed, while Sarah stood awkwardly by the door. The room looked different now, full of expensive flower arrangements and get-well cards. Her simple daisies were nowhere to be seen. "Please sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the chair where she used to sit during her night shifts. "I've been wanting to talk to you." Sarah sat down, smoothing her uniform nervously. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to you." Richard's blue eyes were warm. "The doctors say it's a miracle I woke up so soon, but we both know it wasn't a miracle, was it? It was you, Sarah. Your voice, your stories, your kindness, they gave me something to hold on to in the darkness." Tears threatened to spill from Sarah's eyes. "I just did what anyone would do," Richard shook his head. "No, you did what no one else did. You saw me as a person, not as a bank account. You cared enough to warn me about Victoria and James, even though you had nothing to gain from it." He reached for her hand, just like she used to reach for his. "Do you know what I remember most from those days in the coma? I remember you reading The Little Prince to me. That part about what's essential being invisible to the eyes, that's what you showed me, Sarah. The essential things I couldn't see before." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was James, looking surprised and angry to see Sarah there. "What is she doing here?" he demanded. "Richard, you need to sign these papers. The company..." "I'm not signing anything," Richard cut him off. "And you can tell our lawyers I'm cancelling the power of attorney. I know what you've been trying to do, James. It's over." James's face turned pale. "You don't understand. The market is unstable. I was just trying to protect our interests." "You were trying to steal my company," Richard said calmly. "Just like Victoria was trying to steal my fortune. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Get out, James. We'll talk about this with the lawyers present." After James left, Richard turned back to Sarah. "I owe you so much," he said softly. "You saved more than just my life. You saved everything I've worked for. How can I ever repay you?" Sarah stood up, suddenly feeling out of place in this world of wealth and power. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Davidson. I'm just glad you're better. Please call me Richard. He caught her hand as she turned to leave. Don't go. There's so much more I want to talk about. So much I want to know about you. I'm just a cleaning lady, Sarah whispered. No, Richard said firmly. You're the woman who saw me when I was invisible. You're the voice that brought me back. You're the heart that cared when no one else did. Please, Sarah, give me a chance to know you better. Before Sarah could answer, her supervisor appeared at the door. Sarah, we need you on the 3rd floor. There's been a spill in room 304. Sarah gently pulled her hand from Richard's. I have to go, she said. I'm glad you're better, Richard. As she walked away, she could feel his eyes following her. Her heart was a jumble of emotions. How could this work? They were from different worlds. He was Richard Davidson, the millionaire, businessman. She was just Sarah Martinez, the cleaning lady who talked to coma patients, but his voice echoed in her head. You're the woman who saw me when I was invisible. That night, as Sarah cleaned the floors of the 3rd floor, she couldn't stop thinking about Richard's words, about the way he'd looked at her, about the warmth of his hand holding hers. She thought about Victoria's angry face and James's pale one. They would never accept her in Richard's life. They'd do everything to keep them apart. But then she remembered. All those nights reading to Richard, talking to him, being herself without pretense or fear. He'd heard everything. He'd understood. And he'd asked her to stay. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the quiet hospital corridor, Sarah realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling in love with Richard Davidson. And maybe, just maybe, he was falling in love with her too. But could love really bridge the gap between their worlds? Or would the forces trying to keep them apart prove too strong? Sarah looked out the hospital window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles. But for now she held on to the memory of Richard's smile, of his words, of the way he saw her. Not as a cleaning lady, but as the woman who had brought him back to life. The next few days at St. Mary's Hospital were a whirlwind of chaos. News had gotten out about James and Victoria's attempted takeover of Richard's company, and reporters were everywhere. Security guards had to be posted at every entrance to keep them from sneaking. Sarah tried to focus on her work on the 3rd floor, but it wasn't easy. Everyone was talking about Richard Davidson, about how he'd fired his entire board of directors, about how his brother James had disappeared to the Cayman Islands, about how Victoria was telling anyone who would listen that Richard was mentally unstable after his coma. Did you hear? One of the nurses whispered to Sarah while she mopped the floor. They say Mr. Davidson lost millions because of what his brother did. But he's fighting back. He's hired new lawyers and everything. Sarah just nodded and kept cleaning. She hadn't seen Richard since that day in his room, and maybe that was for the best. She had a job to do, bills to pay, and a simple life to live. She couldn't get caught up in his complicated world, but then Mary, one of the 7th floor nurses, came to find her during her lunch break. Sarah, he's asking for you again, Mary said, sitting down beside her in the break room. He won't eat his meals, he barely sleeps. He just keeps asking where you are. Sarah's heart ached. I can't, Mary. Look what happened last time. Victoria's been banned from the hospital, Mary interrupted with a smile. She made such a scene yesterday, security had to escort her out. She was screaming about how Richard had lost his mind, how she'd sue everyone. It was quite a show. Sarah couldn't help but laugh, picturing Victoria's perfect hair all messed up as she was led away by security. But then she got serious again. It doesn't matter. Richard and we're from different worlds. Once he leaves the hospital, he'll forget all about the cleaning lady who talked to him while he was in a coma. Mary shook her head. I don't think so. You didn't see him yesterday when that fancy lawyer brought in a stack of papers about his company. He was so tired and stressed. But then he picked up that copy of The Little Prince you left in his room. He just held it and smiled, like it reminded him of something good. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. I miss your voice. Please come see me, Richard. How did he get my number? Sarah asked, staring at her phone in surprise. Mary grinned. He can be very persuasive when he wants something. So will you go? Sarah looked at her half-eaten sandwich, then at her cleaning cart waiting in the hallway. "I can't, I have work to do." "Go," Mary said, standing up. "I'll cover for you. Besides, it's almost your break time anyway." Sarah's feet seemed to move, on their own, carrying her to the elevator. As she rode up to the 7th floor, she remembered Victoria's angry face, her harsh words. But she also remembered Richard's gentle smile, the way he'd held her hand, how he'd defended her. When she reached his room, she found him sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the city. He was wearing regular clothes now instead of a hospital gown, expensive-looking pants and a soft sweater that made his eyes look even bluer. "You came," he said, turning to face her. His whole face lit up with a smile. "I can't stay long," Sarah said, hovering by the door. "I have work." "I know. Just sit with me for a minute, please?" She sat down in the chair across from him, noticing how much stronger he looked. Soon he wouldn't need the hospital anymore. Soon he'd go back to his life of board meetings and business deals. "I fired my entire legal team," he said suddenly. "They were all working with James behind my back. I've lost almost a third of my company's value because of what they did." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. Richard shook his head. "Don't be. Money can be earned back. Trust, that's harder to rebuild, but you know what's funny? When I found out what they'd done, I wasn't even angry. I just kept thinking about what you said to me while I was in the coma, about how sometimes the most important things are the ones we can't see." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about what matters in life. Before the accident, I thought I had everything. Money, power, a beautiful fiancé. But I was empty inside. It took losing everything to see what really matters." "And what's that?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "Honesty, kindness, someone who cares about you for who you are, not what you own." He reached for her hand. "Someone like you." Sarah pulled her hand away, standing up quickly. "Richard, we can't. You're still recovering, you're vulnerable." "I've never been more clear-headed in my life," he interrupted. "I know what people will say. I know they'll think I'm crazy, that you're after my money, that it's too soon after Victoria. But I don't care." "You should care," Sarah said, tears filling her eyes. "Your life is complicated enough right now. You need to focus on getting better, on saving your company." "Then help me," he said simply. "Be my friend at least. Let me take you to dinner when I get out of here. Let me know you better." Before Sarah could answer, there was a commotion in the hallway. Through the door's window, she could see Victoria arguing with security guards again. "You can't keep me out," Victoria was shouting. "I'm his fiancé." "Ex-fiancé," Richard called out loudly enough for Victoria to hear. "And I have a restraining order against you now, Victoria. Don't make this worse than it already is." Victoria's face turned purple with rage. She pointed at Sarah through the window. "This is all your fault. You turned him against me. You gold-digging little—" Security finally managed to drag her away, her threats echoing down the hallway. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. "This is exactly what I mean, Richard. Your life is too complicated. I'm just a cleaning lady. I don't belong in your world." Richard stood up, a little unsteady, but determined. He walked over to her and gently touched her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You're wrong," he said softly. "You belong exactly where you are, right here with me. The rest of it, we'll figure it out together. Just give us a chance." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the warmth, the hope. Part of her wanted to run away, back to her simple life of cleaning floors and reading books alone in her small apartment. But another part of her, the part that had talked to him all those nights when he was in a coma, the part that had held his hand in the darkness, wanted to stay, wanted to believe that sometimes love really could bridge the gap between two different worlds. "One dinner," she whispered. "When you're better, that's all I can promise." Richard's smile was like the sun coming out after a storm. "One dinner is all I need. I'll prove to you that what we have is real." As Sarah left his room to return to her work, she felt lighter somehow, despite all the complications. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe Richard Davidson wasn't going to forget about the cleaning lady who brought him back from the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, their story was just beginning. The day Richard Davidson left St. Mary's Hospital was like a circus. News vans lined the street. Reporters shouted questions and photographers' cameras flashed non-stop. Sarah watched it all from the third-floor window, her heart heavy as Richard's fancy car drove away. "He left something for you," Mary said, coming up behind her. She handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a note written in elegant handwriting. "Dinner tomorrow night? I'll send a car." "Richard." Sarah's hands trembled. Was she really going to do this, have dinner with Richard Davidson? "Girl, if you don't go, I'll never forgive you," Mary said, reading the note over Sarah's shoulder. "He's crazy about you." "He's crazy, period," Sarah muttered. But she was already smiling. What would I even wear? That evening, after her shift, Sarah stood in front of her small closet in her tiny apartment, feeling completely lost. Everything she owned looked too plain, too simple for a dinner with someone like Richard. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. "The car will pick you up at 7. Don't worry about dressing up. Just be you." Sarah smiled at the message. Just be you. If only it were that simple. The next evening, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her apartment building. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, opened the door for her. "Miss Martinez? I'm George. Mr. Davidson asked me to take care of you tonight." Sarah smoothed down her simple blue dress, the nicest thing she owned, and got into the car. Her stomach was full of butterflies. But instead of heading toward the fancy restaurants downtown, George drove them to a quiet neighborhood. The car stopped in front of a beautiful house with a garden full of flowers. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, confused. "Mr. Davidson's home," George said with a smile. "He thought you'd be more comfortable here than at a restaurant with people staring and taking pictures." Richard was waiting at the door. He looked different in casual clothes, more relaxed, more real. His face lit up when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, taking her hand. "Come in. I hope you don't mind, but I thought we could have dinner here. I even cooked." Sarah laughed. "You cooked? Well, I tried." He led her to a cozy kitchen where something was definitely burning. "Okay, maybe we should order pizza." Just like that, the tension broke. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and helped him salvage what he could of the dinner. They ended up making sandwiches and eating them in his garden, talking and laughing like old friends. "This is better than any fancy restaurant," Sarah said, looking up at the stars. "You make everything better," Richard replied softly. "These past few weeks have been hell, dealing with lawyers, trying to save my company, facing reporters everywhere I go. But thinking about you, that's what kept me going." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she had to be honest. "Richard, I'm worried. Your life is so complicated. The newspapers are full of stories about your brother stealing from the company, about Victoria threatening to sue you." "Let them write what they want," Richard said firmly. "None of it matters. What matters is that when I was lost in the darkness, your voice brought me back. Your kindness showed me what real love looks like." He took her hand, and Sarah felt that same spark she'd felt in the hospital. "I know this isn't going to be easy," he continued. "People will talk. They'll say awful things about both of us, but I don't care what anyone thinks. I care about you." Before Sarah could respond, they heard a car screech to a stop in front of the house. Angry voices carried through the garden. "Richard," it was Victoria's voice. "I know you're in there. Come out and face me." Richard sighed. "Stay here," he told Sarah, but she followed him anyway. Victoria stood on the front lawn, swaying slightly. She'd clearly been drinking. A young man Sarah recognized from the gossip magazines as Victoria's ex-boyfriend stood beside her, looking uncomfortable. "So it's true," Victoria sneered when she saw Sarah. "You really are dating the cleaning lady. Have you completely lost your mind?" "You need to leave," Richard said calmly. "You're violating the restraining order, Victoria." "Or what?" "You'll have me arrested." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Go ahead. The press will love that, how you had your faithful fiancé arrested while you cavort with the help." "Faithful?" Richard's voice was cold now. "Is that what you call plotting with my brother to steal my company? Is that what you call running back to Chad here the minute I was in a coma?" Victoria's face went white. "How did you know about Chad?" "I heard everything while I was in that hospital bed, everything, including your plans with James, your secret meetings, your true feelings about me." Sarah wasn't the only one who heard you plotting. Victoria took a step back, stumbling, slightly. You're lying. You couldn't have heard. Leave now, Richard said quietly, or I'll call the police. And then I'll tell the press exactly why our engagement ended. Every detail, Victoria, including the offshore accounts you and James set up. Victoria's face crumpled. She turned and ran back to her car, Chad hurrying after her. They drove away. With tires squealing, Sarah stood there, shaking slightly. This was Richard's world, full of drama, betrayal, and public scandals. How could she ever fit into it? But then Richard turned to her, his face soft with concern. I'm so sorry about that. Are you okay? Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. Behind the wealth and the power, she saw the same man she'd talked to all those nights in the hospital. The man who'd held her hand in the darkness. The man who'd rather make sandwiches with her than eat at a fancy restaurant. I'm okay, she said, reaching for his hand. But you're right, this isn't going to be easy. Richard pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Nothing worth having ever is. But we'll face it together. They stood there in his garden, holding each other under the stars. Sarah knew there would be more drama, more complications, more obstacles to overcome. Victoria wouldn't give up easily. James might come back from the Cayman Islands. The press would have a field day with their story. But for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the way Richard looked at her, the way he held her, the way he saw her, not as a cleaning lady, but as the woman who had saved him in more ways than one. Stay, he whispered against her hair. Stay with me tonight, just to talk, to be together. I'm not ready to let you go yet. Sarah thought about her tiny apartment, her simple life, her morning shift tomorrow. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the complications that lay ahead. Then she thought about all those nights she'd spent reading to Richard, talking to him, being herself without fear or pretense. He'd heard her then, and he was hearing her now. I'll stay, she whispered back. We can talk all night, just like we used to. Richard smiled, and in that smile, Sarah saw their future. Complicated, challenging, but full of love. Real love. The kind that sees past wealth and status to the heart beneath. As they walked back into the house together, Sarah realized something. Sometimes the biggest risks in life lead to the greatest rewards. And sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales can come true, even for a cleaning lady and a billionaire who found love in the most unexpected place. The morning newspapers were merciless. Davidson Dynasty disaster, screamed one headline. Billionaire's bedside romance, declared another, with a grainy photo of Sarah leaving Richard's house early in the morning. Sarah's hands shook as she read the articles during her break at the hospital. They made her sound like a gold digger who had taken advantage of a vulnerable man. Some even suggested she had helped James steal from the company, using her position as a cleaning lady to spy on Richard while he was in a coma. Don't let them get to you, Mary said, putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. We all know the truth, but the truth was getting harder to hold on to. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters. Some had even found her tiny apartment, camping outside with cameras. She'd had to stay at her sister Rosa's house just to get some peace. You need to end this thing with Richard, Rosa had told her last night. It's not worth all this trouble. Maybe Rosa was right. Maybe it would be better for everyone if she just... Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Missing you, dinner tonight? Despite everything, Sarah smiled. They'd spent almost every evening together this past week, talking. For hours, sharing their lives, their dreams, their fears. Richard had told her about growing up in his father's shadow, about the pressure to always be perfect, about how empty his life had felt before the accident. Sarah had told him about losing her parents young, about working her way through school, about finding joy in helping others, even if she couldn't cure them. They'd talked about books, movies, their favorite foods, all the little things that made them who they were beyond their labels of billionaire and cleaning lady. But now, looking at the newspapers, Sarah wondered if love was really enough to bridge their worlds. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a blocked number. When she answered, a familiar voice sent chills down her spine. Hello, Sarah. It was James Davidson. We need to talk. Sarah's heart raced. How did you get my number? I have my ways, James said smoothly. Meet me at the Black Swan Cafe in an hour. Come alone, or I'll make sure every newspaper in the country Gets proof that you helped me steal from my brother's company. But that's a lie. Truth is whatever people believe, my dear. And right now, they'll believe anything about the cleaning lady who seduced a billionaire. 1 hour, Sarah, don't be late. The line went dead. Sarah sat there trembling. Should she tell Richard? No, he was in meetings all day trying to save his company. She had to handle this herself. The Black Swan Cafe was quiet when Sarah arrived. James sat in a corner booth looking tanned from his time in the Cayman Islands. He smiled when he saw her, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sit down, Sarah. Would you like some coffee? What do you want, James? He leaned forward. I want to help. You're in over your head and you know it. The press is destroying you. Soon they'll start digging into your past, your family, everything. Do you really want that? Sarah lifted her chin. I have nothing to hide. Everyone has something to hide. James pulled out an envelope. Here's what I'm offering. $2 million. Cash. Take it and disappear. Leave Richard, leave the hospital, start a new life somewhere else. Sarah stared at the envelope. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of having. And if I don't... James's smile turned cold. Then I'll destroy you. I have friends at every newspaper, every TV station. By the time I'm done, no one will hire you to clean toilets, let alone believe you're worthy of Richard Davidson. You're just like Victoria, Sarah said quietly. You think everything and everyone can be bought. That's because it's true. James pushed the envelope toward her. Take the money, Sarah. It's more than you'll ever make cleaning floors. More than Richard will give you when he finally comes to his senses. Sarah stood up, her hands steady now. You don't know your brother at all, do you? He's not like you. James, he knows what really matters in life. And what's that, love? James laughed. Love won't pay your bills. Love won't stop the press from tearing you apart. Love won't bridge the gap between your world and his. Maybe not, Sarah admitted. But at least I know what real love feels like. Can you say the same? She walked out of the cafe, leaving the envelope on the table. But James's words followed her, mixing with all her own doubts and fears. When she got back to the hospital, there was chaos in the lobby. Victoria was there with a TV crew, crying dramatically for the cameras. I just want everyone to know the truth, she was saying. Richard Davidson is not himself. That accident changed him. He needs help, not some gold-digging cleaning lady taking advantage of him. Sarah tried to slip past unnoticed, but Victoria saw her. There she is, the woman who stole my fiancé while he was vulnerable. How do you sleep at night? Cameras swung. Towards Sarah. Microphones appeared in her face. Questions came from all directions. Did you help James Davidson steal from the company? Were you having an affair with Richard before his accident? How much money are you expecting to get from him? Sarah couldn't breathe. The lights, the cameras, the accusations, it was all too much. Then a strong arm wrapped around her waist. Richard was there, appearing like a shield between her and the chaos. That's enough, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Victoria, you're violating the restraining order again. Officers, please remove her and her camera crew. As security led Victoria away, still shouting for the cameras, Richard turned to Sarah. His eyes filled with concern when he saw her pale face. What's wrong? Did something else happen? Sarah looked up at him. This man who had changed her life. In so many ways. She thought about James's offer, about Victoria's accusations, about all the obstacles standing between them. We need to talk, she whispered. Richard's face tightened with worry, but he nodded. Let's go somewhere quiet. They ended up in the hospital garden, where they'd first started falling in love. The roses were blooming, their sweet scent filling the air. James came to see me today, Sarah said. He offered me money to leave you. Richard's hands clenched into fists. How much? $2 million. And? Sarah touched his face gently. And I walked away. Money isn't what I want, Richard. It never was. He pulled her close, holding her tight. I know that. I've always known that. But Sarah, if this is too much for you, the press, Victoria, all of it, I'll understand if you want to end it. Sarah thought about James's words, about Victoria's tears, about all the newspaper headlines. Then she thought about those nights in the hospital, reading to Richard, talking to him, being herself. I don't want to end it, she said softly. But I'm scared. Your world is so different from mine. What if they're right? What if love isn't enough? Richard kissed her then, soft and sweet, right there in the hospital garden where their story had begun. Love is everything, he whispered against her lips. The rest is just noise. We'll face it together, one day at a time. As they stood there, in each other's arms, Sarah knew there would be more storms to weather. James wouldn't give up easily. Victoria would keep causing drama. The press would continue to speculate and criticize, but maybe Richard was right. Maybe love really was everything. And maybe, just maybe, their love was strong enough to weather any storm. 2 weeks had passed since James's attempt to buy Sarah off, and life had settled into a strange new normal. Sarah still worked her shifts at the hospital, but now she had to deal with whispers and stares. Some patients requested different cleaning staff, not wanting the gold digger from the newspapers in their rooms. But others, like old Mrs. Johnson in room 312, were different. "Don't you listen to those vultures, Mrs. Johnson told her one morning while Sarah cleaned her room. "I saw how you cared for that young man when he was in his coma. That was real love, not some scheme." Sarah smiled gratefully, but her heart was heavy. The press hadn't let up. Every day brought new stories, new accusations. Someone had dug up her father's old gambling debts, suggesting she was just like him, looking for an easy way to get rich. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Turn on Channel 7 now." Sarah borrowed Mrs. Johnson's TV remote and switched to Channel 7. Her heart stopped. James Davidson was doing a live interview, looking polished and sincere. "I'm worried about my brother," he was saying. "This cleaning lady has him completely under her spell. She worked with Victoria to get close to him, but when Victoria had a change of heart and tried to expose their plan, this woman turned Richard against her. Now she's isolated him from everyone who truly cares about him." "That's a lie," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking. "And what about the missing company funds?" the interviewer asked. James shook his head sadly. "All I know is that certain documents disappeared while my brother was in his coma. Documents that would prove where that money went, and who had access to his room during that time. Who was there late at night, when no one else was around?" Sarah turned off the TV, feeling sick. Mrs. Johnson reached out and patted her hand. "That man's smile doesn't reach his eyes," the old woman said wisely. "My Harold had the same look when he was lying about his poker games." Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was Mary. "Get up here now," her friend said urgently. "Victoria's here with the police." Sarah ran to the elevator, her heart pounding. When she reached the main lobby, she found a crowd gathered around Victoria, who was talking to two serious-looking detectives. "I have proof," Victoria was saying loudly, waving a folder. "Proof that she helped James steal the money, then betrayed him to get closer to Richard. She planned this whole thing." The detectives looked uncomfortable with Victoria's theatrical performance, but they had to do their jobs. "Miss Martinez," one of them called out, spotting Sarah. "We need to ask you some questions." But before they could reach her, a commanding voice cut through the chaos, not without her lawyer present. Richard strode into the lobby, followed by an elegant older woman carrying a briefcase. "I'm Margaret Chen," the woman said, stepping between Sarah and the detectives. "I represent Miss Martinez. Any questions for my client will go through me." Victoria's face turned red. "She can't afford a lawyer like Margaret Chen?" "No," Richard said coldly. "But I can. And since these ridiculous accusations are only happening because of her association with me, I'm making sure she has the best legal protection possible." He turned to Victoria, his eyes hard. "You should leave now and take your fake evidence with you." "Fake?" Victoria sputtered. "I have documents." "Documents that James created," Richard interrupted. "Did he tell you we found his contact at the printing company, the one who forged those papers? He's very cooperative now that we've offered him immunity in exchange for his testimony." Victoria's face went pale. She grabbed her designer purse and practically ran from the lobby, leaving her folder of evidence behind. The detectives looked relieved. "Sorry for the disturbance," one of them said. "We had to follow up on the complaint, but clearly this was just a desperate attempt at revenge." Margaret Chen finished smoothly. "I trust this matter is closed." After the detectives left, Sarah turned to Richard. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw. "I let James and Victoria hurt you for too long. That stops now." Margaret Chen cleared her throat. "We should talk about next steps. James's TV appearance was a clear case of defamation. We can file charges." "No," Sarah said firmly. "No more legal battles, no more drama. I just want it to stop." Richard studied her face. "What do you want to do?" Sarah looked around the hospital lobby. This place had been her home for so long. She'd made friends here, helped people here, found love here. But now it felt tainted by all the accusations and lies. I think I need to leave." "Leave? The hospital?" Richard asked. "Leave everything, just for a while?" Sarah took a deep breath. "My sister Rosa has a small house in Maine. Maybe I could go there just until things calm down." Richard's face fell. "You want to leave me too?" "No." Sarah touched his cheek gently. "Never." "But Richard, look at what's happening. Your brother and Victoria are destroying your reputation because of me. Your company's stock is falling. The press won't leave us alone. Maybe if I go away for a while, they'll lose interest. Or maybe they'll say I drove you away," Richard said bitterly. "That you finally showed your true colors and ran off with the money James claims you stole." "Then come with me," Sarah said suddenly. "Just for a few weeks. Leave someone else in charge of the company. Come to Maine and let's just be us. No press, no drama, no crazy exes trying to destroy us." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see him wrestling with the idea. His company was still vulnerable after James's theft. The board was pushing for major changes. The press was watching his every move, but then he smiled. That warm, real smile that was just for her. "When do we leave?" Margaret Chen sighed. "I'll have my office draft a temporary leadership plan for the board, and I'll get restraining orders that cover all 50 states, just in case Victoria gets any ideas about following you." As they walked out of the hospital together, Sarah felt lighter than she had in weeks. But she also felt eyes on them, nurses, patients, visitors, all watching and whispering. "Are you sure about this?" she asked Richard. "Leaving everything behind?" He stopped and turned to her. "Sarah, when I was in that coma, lost in the darkness, your voice was my anchor. Your stories gave me hope. Your love brought me back. The company, the money, the press, none of that matters without you." Sarah thought about their first real conversation in his hospital room, about their sandwich dinner in his garden, about all the moments, big and small, that had brought them to this point. "I love you," she said simply. Richard kissed her, right there in front of everyone. "I love you too, and I'll love you in Maine or anywhere else you want to go." As they drove away from the hospital, Sarah looked back one last time. So much had happened within those walls. She'd gone from being just a cleaning lady to being the woman who loved Richard Davidson, and who was loved by him in return. The road ahead was still uncertain. James and Victoria weren't done causing trouble. The press wouldn't give up easily. There would be more storms to weather, more obstacles to overcome. But for now they had each other. For now they had love. And maybe, just maybe, that really was enough. Rosa's house in Maine was everything Sarah remembered from childhood summers. Cozy wooden cabin nestled among pine trees, with a view of the ocean from the back porch. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the only sounds were seagulls and waves. "It's perfect," Sarah said, breathing in the salty air. No reporters, no cameras, no drama. Richard wrapped his arms around her from behind as they stood on the porch. Just us. They settled into a peaceful routine. Richard worked remotely, having video calls with his new board of directors. Sarah helped Rosa in her small bakery in town, enjoying the simple pleasure of making bread and cookies, without anyone whispering about her or taking pictures. The locals didn't seem to care that Richard Davidson, the famous billionaire, was living among them. To them, he was just the nice man who came to the bakery every morning for coffee and always complimented Rosa's cinnamon rolls. "This is what normal feels like," Richard said one evening as they walked along the beach. "I'd forgotten what it was like to just live, without all the pressure, all the expectations." Sarah squeezed his hand. Are you bored? Are you kidding? He pulled her close. I'm happier than I've ever been, but their peace wasn't destined to last. One morning, Sarah was alone at the bakery while Rosa made deliveries. A customer came in, a tall man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in their small town. Can I help you? Sarah asked. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Actually, I'm here to help you, Miss Martinez. My name is Robert Kane. I represent James Davidson. Sarah's heart stopped. Get out! Please hear me out. Kane pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. James feels terrible about everything that's happened. He wants to make things right by sending another lawyer to threaten me. No threats. Kane raised his hands. Just truth. James has proof that Victoria was behind everything. The theft, the media attacks, all of it. He's willing to come forward and clear your name. Sarah crossed her arms. What's the catch? James wants his brother back. The company is struggling without Richard. The board is talking about selling to their biggest competitor. Thousands of jobs are at risk. Kane leaned forward. All James is asking is that you convince Richard to come back to New York, to save the company their father built. If the company's in trouble, why hasn't Richard said anything? Kane smiled sadly. Because he's trying to protect you. He doesn't want you to feel guilty about him being here. But check the business news. The stock is falling. Investors are pulling out. They're saying Richard Davidson has lost his edge, that love has made him soft. Sarah's hands trembled. She grabbed her phone and searched for news about Davidson. Enterprises. Her heart sank as she read headline after headline. Davidson empire crumbling. Stocks plummet as CEO plays house in Maine. Thousands of jobs at risk. What exactly does James want? Sarah asked quietly. Just talk to Richard. Convince him to go back to New York to focus on saving the company. James will clear your name and you can join Richard later once everything's stable. And if I don't, Kane shrugged. Then thousands of people lose their jobs, and everyone will blame the cleaning lady who destroyed Richard Davidson. After Kane left, Sarah sat alone in the bakery, her mind racing. She thought about all the employees at Davidson Enterprises, all the families, depending on those jobs. Was she being selfish, keeping Richard here in their peaceful bubble while his company crumbled? That evening she watched Richard as he worked on his laptop on the porch. He looked so relaxed, so happy. But was it real, or was he just hiding his worries to protect her? Richard, she said softly. Are we hiding here? He looked up, surprised. What do you mean? From reality, from responsibility, from your company? Richard closed his laptop. Who talked to you, James, Victoria? A lawyer, Kane. He showed me the news about the company. Sarah sat beside him. Why didn't you tell me things were so bad? Richard sighed. Because they're not. Not really. Yes, the stock is down, but that's temporary. The board isn't happy that I'm working remotely, but the company is solid. James is just trying to manipulate us again. But what if he's right? What if people are losing their jobs because you're here with me instead of there? Sarah, look at me. Richard took her hands. Do you know what I was doing on my laptop just now? Finalizing a merger that will save those jobs and make the company stronger. I don't need to be in New York to run my business. I just need to be where I'm happy. And that's here with you. Sarah wanted to believe him, but Kane's words echoed in her head. Everyone will blame the cleaning lady who destroyed Richard Davidson. Maybe. She took a deep breath. Maybe I should go away for a while. Let you focus on the company without worrying about me. No, Richard's voice was firm. That's exactly what they want. To separate us, to make us doubt each other. James tried to steal my company once. I won't let him manipulate us into giving him another chance. He pulled Sarah into his arms. Do you trust me? Yes. Then trust that I know what I'm doing. The company is fine. James is lying just like he always does. And I'm exactly where I want to be. Sarah relaxed into his embrace, letting the sound of the waves soothe her fears. But later that night, she couldn't sleep. She got up and went to the kitchen for some water. Rosa was there, looking worried. Sarah, you need to see this, she handed Sarah her phone. There was a video playing, James Davidson on a morning news show, looking concerned and sincere. "I just want my brother to come home," he was saying. "This woman has isolated him, convinced him to abandon his responsibilities. Our father built this company to help people, to provide jobs and opportunities. Now it's all falling apart because Richard chose love over duty." The interviewer looked sympathetic. "And what would you say to Sarah Martinez if she's watching?" James looked directly into the camera. "Let him go. If you really love my brother, let him come back to New York. Let him be the leader he was meant to be. Don't be the woman who destroyed everything our family built." Sarah turned off the phone, her hands shaking. She thought about Richard sleeping peacefully upstairs, about how happy they'd been these past weeks. But she also thought about all the people depending on Davidson Enterprises, about Richard's father's legacy, about the responsibility that came with his name. "What are you thinking?" Rosa asked softly. Sarah looked out the window at the dark ocean. "I'm thinking that sometimes love means making hard choices." She went back upstairs and watched Richard sleep. He looked so peaceful, so free from the burdens he'd carried all his life. Could she really be the reason he lost everything his family had built? Sarah touched his cheek gently, memorizing his face. Then she began to pack her bag. The sun was just rising when Sarah finished writing the letter. Her hands trembled as she placed it on Richard's pillow. He was still asleep on the couch downstairs, where he dozed off watching an old movie with her last night. "I'm sorry," she whispered, touching his letter one last time. Then she picked up her small suitcase and crept down the stairs. Rosa was waiting in the kitchen. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes, I do." Sarah hugged her sister tight. "Take care of him for me?" "You know he'll come looking for you." Sarah shook her head. "Not if he believes I never really loved him. That's why the letter has to be cruel. He has to think I was just using him all along." Rosa wiped away tears. "It's not fair. You love each other so much. Sometimes love isn't enough." Sarah looked out at the sunrise, painting the ocean pink and gold. "Sometimes you have to love someone enough to let them go." George, Richard's driver, who had become their friend in Maine, was waiting outside with the car. He'd argued with Sarah all night about this plan, but in the end, he'd agreed to help. "Are you sure about this, Miss Sarah?" he asked as she got into the car. "Just drive, George, please." As they pulled away from the house, Sarah forced herself not to look back. She didn't want to see the moment Richard would wake up, find her letter and have his heart broken all over again. The letter she'd written was full of lies. It said she'd been working with James all along, that she'd only pretended to care for Richard to help James take control of the company. It said she'd realized she could never be part of his world, that she was tired of pretending to be something she wasn't. It said goodbye. Every word felt like a knife in her heart, but she had to make him believe it, had to make him angry enough to go back to New York, to save his company, to be the man he was meant to be. They were halfway to the airport when Sarah's phone rang. It was Mary from the hospital. "Sarah, thank God you answered. You need to know something. That lawyer who came to see you, Kane, he doesn't work for James." Sarah's heart stopped. "What?" "I got worried after you told me about his visit, so I did some digging. He works for Michael Anderson, Richard's biggest competitor, the one trying to buy Davidson Enterprises." Sarah's mind raced. The stock prices, the news stories, James's TV appearance. Had it all been part of a plan? "George, turn around!" she cried. "We have to go back." But before George could turn the car, a black SUV slammed into them from behind. Sarah screamed as their car spun off the road. Through the window, she saw Victoria behind the wheel of the SUV with Kane beside her. George managed to keep control of the car, but they were stuck in a ditch. The SUV stopped, and Kane got out, walking toward them with a cold smile. "Going somewhere, Miss Martinez? I'm afraid we can't let you warn Richard just yet. Not until the sale goes through." Victoria stepped out too, looking triumphant. "You really thought James was behind all this? Please. He's probably passed out drunk on some beach in the Cayman Islands. We just used his name because you'd believe it." "We?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Michael Anderson has wanted to buy Davidson Enterprises for years," Kane explained. "But Richard would never sell. Then Victoria here came to us with a brilliant plan. Use his accident to take control of the company, then drive down the stock price until he'd have no choice but to sell. Victoria laughed. And you played your part perfectly. The lonely cleaning lady who fell in love with a billionaire. The scandal was better than we could have hoped for. Investors lost confidence, the stock kept falling, and now Richard will have to sell to save the company, Kane finished. Especially once his true love abandons him. Broken hearts make for bad business decisions. Sarah's phone was still connected to Mary, who had heard everything. She just prayed her friend would know what to do. You won't get away with this, Sarah said, trying to sound braver than she felt. We already have. Victoria pulled out a gun. Now you're going to get in our car. We just need you to disappear for a few days, just until Richard signs the sale papers. Sarah looked at George, silently telling him to stay in the car. Then she got out, her hands raised. You know he'll never stop looking for me, she said. Oh, he won't look. Victoria smiled cruelly. Not after he reads that letter you wrote. Not after his cleaning lady breaks his heart and runs away with his money. He'll be too ashamed to even admit you existed. As Victoria and Kane led her toward their SUV, Sarah heard sirens in the distance. Mary must have called the police. But would they get there in time? Suddenly, another car came roaring around the corner. Sarah's heart leaped as she recognized Richard behind the wheel. Rosa was beside him, and they weren't alone. Several police cars were right behind them. Get in the car, Kane shouted to Victoria, grabbing Sarah's arm. But Sarah wasn't going to be a victim anymore. She stomped hard on Kane's foot and twisted away. Victoria raised the gun, but before she could fire, Richard's car screeched to a stop between them. Sarah, he yelled, jumping out. Are you okay? She ran to him as police cars surrounded them. Officers jumped out with weapons drawn, ordering Victoria and Kane to surrender. How did you find me? Sarah asked as Richard held her tight. Rosa showed me the real letter, the one you wrote before you wrote the fake one. The one that told the truth about Kane's visit and why you were leaving. He kissed her forehead. Did you really think I wouldn't see through those lies? Victoria was screaming as the police handcuffed her. Kane was trying to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but Sarah barely heard them. All she could focus on was Richard's heartbeat against her cheek. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I thought I was protecting you, protecting the company. Sarah, look at me. Richard tilted her chin up. The company is fine. Those news stories were fake, planted by Anderson's people. The stock price drop was artificial. They were manipulating the market. None of it was real. But James on TV was a lookalike actor. The real James called me this morning from rehab. He's been there for weeks trying to get better. Richard smiled sadly. Victoria and Anderson took advantage of everyone's assumptions about James to play their game. Sarah felt overwhelmed. I almost left you because of their lies. But you didn't? And even if you had, I would have found you. No company, no money, no lies can change what we have. He kissed her softly. I love you, Sarah Martinez. The real you, not the cleaning lady, not the gold digger from the papers, just you. As the police led Victoria and Kane away, as the sun rose fully over the ocean, as George and Rosa hugged them both, Sarah finally understood. Love wasn't about sacrifice or protection or letting go. Love was about holding on, fighting back, and believing in each other, no matter what lies the world tried to tell them. Take me home, she whispered to Richard. He smiled, and in that smile was every promise they'd ever made to each other. We are home wherever we're together. That's home. 1 year had passed since that dramatic morning on the Maine coast. Victoria and Kane were in prison for their scheme to manipulate the stock market and kidnap Sarah. Michael Anderson's company was under federal investigation, and James had completed his rehab program, making amends with Richard and starting a new life away from the business world. But for Sarah, the biggest changes weren't in the headlines. They were in the little moments that made up her new life. She stood in the garden of what was now her home, the same cozy Maine house where she and Richard had found peace. The ocean sparkled in the distance, and fresh flowers bloomed everywhere. It was a perfect spring morning. Are you ready? Rosa asked, adjusting Sarah's simple white dress. Sarah touched the daisies in her bouquet, just like the ones she'd brought to Richard's hospital room so long ago. I've been ready since the day I first read to him in that hospital room. The garden was filled with their real friends. Mary from the hospital, George the driver and his family, Mrs. Johnson, who had finally left the hospital and moved to a cottage nearby. Even some of Sarah's former cleaning staff colleagues had come, all of them smiling and crying happy tears. There were no reporters, no cameras, no society photographers. Richard had made sure of that. This day was just for them and the people who had stood by them through everything. "Your father would be so proud," Rosa whispered, fixing Sarah's veil. "Both our parents would be." Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. Their parents hadn't lived to see this day, but she felt their love all around her. In the garden they'd helped plant, in the ocean they'd loved, in the simple, honest life they'd taught their daughters to value. The music started playing. Not a fancy orchestra, but a local band that played at Rosa's bakery on weekends. Sarah took a deep breath and turned toward the flower-lined path. Richard stood waiting for her under an arch of roses. He looked handsome in his suit, but what made Sarah's heart skip was his smile, that real, warm smile that was just for her, the one she'd first seen when he woke up from his coma, and recognized her voice. As she walked toward him, Sarah remembered all the moments that had led them here. The nights reading to him in the hospital, their first real conversation, the sandwiches, in his garden, the peace they'd found in Maine, the morning they'd fought back against the lies trying to tear them apart. When she reached Richard, he took her hands in his. His eyes were bright with tears. "I still hear your voice, you know," he whispered so only she could hear. "Every morning when I wake up, every night before I sleep, the voice that brought me back from the darkness, the voice that taught me what real love sounds like." The minister began the ceremony, but Sarah barely heard the words. She was lost in Richard's eyes, in the love she saw there, in the future stretching out before them. "The rings, please," the minister said. Mary stepped forward with a velvet box. Inside were two simple gold bands, no diamonds, no elaborate designs. Just like their love, the rings were pure and true and strong. "I, Richard Davidson," he began, his voice strong and clear, "take you, Sarah Martinez, to be my wife, not because of any money or status or what the world expects, but because you saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I was lost. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself." He slipped the ring onto her finger. "I promise to love you every day, to be worthy of your trust, to build a life with you that's real and honest and completely ours." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the second ring. "I, Sarah Martinez, take you, Richard Davidson, to be my husband, not because of your name or your wealth or what others might think, but because you heard me when no one else was listening. You valued me for who I am, not what I did. You chose love over everything else." She placed the ring on his finger. "I promise to stand by you always, to face whatever comes together, to keep building this beautiful life we've found. By the power vested in me," the minister said, smiling, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Richard pulled Sarah close and kissed her like they were the only two people in the world. Their friends cheered and threw flower petals, but Sarah and Richard stayed lost in their own moment, their own perfect piece of happiness. The key reception was exactly what they wanted, a simple celebration in the garden. Tables were loaded with Rosa's baking, local seafood, and homemade dishes brought by their friends. Children ran playing between the tables while their parents danced to the band's music. James came up to them looking healthy and at peace. "I have a wedding gift for you both," he said, handing them an envelope. Inside was a deed to the main house and the surrounding land. "You were going to buy it anyway," James said, "but I wanted to do this, to show you that I understand now what really matters." Sarah hugged him, remembering how far they'd all come from those dark days of betrayal and lies. Later, as the sun set over the ocean, Richard led Sarah down to the beach for a quiet moment alone. The sound of music and laughter drifted down from the garden, but here by the water it was peaceful. "Are you happy?" Richard asked, holding her close. Sarah looked up at her husband. The words still made her heart flutter. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible. No regrets about leaving the hospital, about leaving, about choosing this life instead of New York? None." Sarah touched his face gently. "This is where we belong. This is who we are." Richard smiled and pulled something from his pocket, a worn copy of The Little Prince. I thought maybe we could read a little, he said. For old time's sake. Sarah took the book, opening to their favorite page. What is essential is invisible to the eye, she read softly. One sees clearly only with the heart, Richard finished from memory. They stood, there on the beach, holding each other as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over them in the hospital, in his garden, through all their struggles and triumphs. I love you, Sarah Davidson, Richard whispered. Sarah's heart filled with joy at her new name, at this new chapter in their story. I love you too, always. As they walked back up to their celebration, hand in hand, Sarah thought about all the people who had said their love would never last, the ones who had tried to tear them apart with lies and schemes, the ones who couldn't understand how a cleaning lady and a billionaire could find real happiness together. But they had never seen what Sarah and Richard had built, a love based on trust and understanding, on seeing each other's true hearts, on choosing each other every day no matter what the world threw at them. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real, and it was just beginning.